Hello, everyone. I'm Becca, dietitian by trade, mom 24/7, wife from the start, and when there's a few extra hours in the day, you might find me hitting the trails or on horseback.
And I'm Kara, a therapist to women, a mom to a boy, an entrepreneur, mountain junkie, and a postpartum runner.
And this is Fit for a Queen, a podcast that's devoted to the female athlete wanting to balance the teeter-totter of all the things we desire out of life as women: performance, health, intellect, and taking time for self, even if we only get 1 minute out of the day.
We're so excited to be bringing you the queens in the athletic world who have done just that. Okay, ladies, take a seat at your thrones, grab your crowns, and welcome to Fit for a Queen.
Well, welcome back, queens. We have John Hereth today. John Hereth is a physical therapist, and John graduated from Penn Valley and became licensed as a physical therapist assistant in 2009. He currently treats patients and is the assistant administrator at Summit Rehab in Lee Summit, Missouri. Professionally, John's interests include sports and orthopedic physical therapy, injury prevention, chronic pain, and following a movement-based approach popularized by the works of Gray Cook, Charlie Wangroff, Dr. Vladimir Janda, and Dr. Stuart McGill. Phew. As a therapist and athlete, John enjoys looking at the mechanics of human movement in order to help patients achieve maximum performance in their own lives. An active strength athlete and Highland Games competitor, John has become one of the go-to rehab specialists for strength and barbell sports across the area. And didn't you guys just win a big honor, you and your team?
We did, actually. I actually was captain of what is called the Team South at North versus South Highland Games. It's a top amateur competition down in Florida every year, and we won. It's the first time Team South in several years. So we won that, and I retired from Highland Games with that. So now I'm just trying to become more of an athlete and less of a fat kid.
Oh, that's awesome. That's the way you retire, right? Going out on top.
Go on top.
Yep.
So, queens, I want to share with you why I decided to have John on. I call him my foot guru, having had issues with my feet for most of my life that are pretty genetic. I was at a crossroads that I was quite certain I was going to have surgery, and came in and saw John and went out with a big smile on my face because he didn't say that I necessarily needed to, and gave me some things to work on at home, including something as simple as just learning how to re-stand and walk. That's right. Yeah, sometimes we just give in over time, literally, and have to learn to walk more balanced. So that's why I wanted to have John on today.
If you've seen Beccas feet, audience, you would totally understand.
God, thanks. I'm going to have a foot complex. So let's start with, why is our feet so important?
I think for most people, it's pretty self-evident, but the foot is the first point of contact with the ground. And so as the foot shapes and develops, especially as we grow, the brain uses the foot so much to figure out where the rest of the body is in space. And so we get so much feedback from the foot, and it helps all the way up the chain. It helps kind of establish where we're at all the way up the chain. And so I think when we start looking at not only just foot dysfunction, but also up the chain to the knee and the hip, sometimes even the low back, the foot can play a big role in helping the brain know where things are in space. Another thing along with that too is you have so much sensory input from the foot that there's a big, huge portion of your brain dedicated to understanding where that foot is in place or in space, and all that sensory information that can be brought from the foot, like I said earlier, all the way up the chain. And so it has huge implications on everything else we're doing. And if we do have foot dysfunction, there's definitely going to be dysfunction further on up the chain for sure.
Well, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So what are some of the common foot injuries or chronic overuse injuries that you typically see in your practice?
Oh, we see a ton. I'd say some of the biggest ones are plantar fasciitis. We see a ton of Achilles tendonitis. We treat a lot of post-op Achilles ruptures as well. Another really common one that people tend to think is genetic, but it's not, are bunions.
Oh, I see. I was already saying mine was genetic.
Yeah, and it's funny. So bunions, there's been no research ever showing that bunions are genetic, and they're purely due to gait mechanics, typically, and what shoes we wear. Cute shoes tend to lead towards bunions. But we see a ton of that too. But I can't tell you how many patients I have come in and like, well, I have bunions. My mom had bunions. My grandma had bunions. And a huge portion of it, there can be some genetic components in terms of, are they prone to be more flat-footed, et cetera, but the bunion itself is always due to a mechanical component.
So for treatment of that, are they coming in and you are working on kind of the gait and the mechanics and how you walk and run as sort of the treatment for that?
Yeah, it obviously the answer to all of those questions is it depends. But for the majority of people, a lot of times what happens is there's usually some sort of loading strategy problem. How the brain interprets how to manage loads at the foot can be appropriate for the situation or not appropriate for the situation. And oftentimes, and you'll get varying opinions on the whys behind this, but in my opinion, it's oftentimes due to footwear choices, how much time we spend as a child barefoot, and so. But I'm kind of tangenting off here. But a lot of times, what we'll see is as we try to correct that, the symptoms and the pain that they're having then start to resolve. One of the things you have to keep in mind with the foot too is we're super susceptible to overuse injuries just because of how much repetitive motion it goes through. If you're a fairly active person, you take 10,000 steps or so in a day. If you're a runner, even more. And that's a lot of repetitively doing things right or doing things poorly.
Well, I was just going to ask that, I'm assuming it's a myth, like because I'm a runner, I'm going to have foot problems, or because I'm a runner, I'm going to have knee problems. We've talked about this, but do you think that's necessarily true because I run a lot, so spend time on my feet, I am going to have more feet problems, or is it just more like how I run and the mechanics around it more often than not?
I'd say both. I'd say, if you drive your car a lot, you're going to have to do more maintenance on it. If you don't drive your car and you're not worried about driving your car, it can kind of just sit. That said, I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with running or really any other movements at all, ever. It's just the big questions that I ask myself and then I ask patients are we putting your joints in positions that they can absorb and adapt to stress? And that's on the rehab side of things. That's also on the performance side of things, because that's what we're trying to do, right? We're trying to adapt to stress. And so I think bearing that in mind, sometimes there's some biomechanic things that we can fix, positional things that we can fix that allow that joint to absorb and adapt to stress. But sometimes, especially if we don't properly program and say you go from not running at all to trying to run 10 miles, probably going to hurt because you've not built the capacity. And so the two things we always want to look at is biomechanically, are we in good positions to absorb and adapt to stress? And then capacity-wise, have I worked and built up the capacity I need to perform whatever task at hand that I'm trying to do? And so typically, if you check those two boxes, not only is your programming going to probably prevent a lot of injuries, it's also going to be optimal for whatever performance aspects that you're wanting to do.
Well, interesting. Yeah, like we've got to get our foot ready to be able to handle the mileage or hiking or whatever else that we're going to do.
That makes sense. Do you have an opinion on barefoot running at all?
Yeah.
So yes. That said, inherently there's nothing wrong with it. I don't know if it's probably the wisest choice, especially if you're running on concrete or asphalt. But inherently, if you're biomechanics are perfect and you've gradually graded your loading so that you can tolerate barefoot running on concrete, there's probably nothing wrong with it. However, if your mechanics are terrible and you're not a runner and you're used to wearing these big motion control shoes, and then you try to barefoot run, you've now removed the only thing that was protecting you in the first place, and you're probably going to screw yourself up pretty quickly.
That makes sense.
So on that kind of continued theme with prevention, how do we start preventing some of these foot injuries? Or here, I always thought it was my genetics. I know when I came and saw you, you were telling me that I have to retrain my brain how to stand. And I was like, oh my God, this is ridiculous. And so I'm just kidding. I went home and was like actually standing there getting at the kitchen, getting dinner ready. And then like later on, I'm like, oh, wait a minute, my back is like a little tired and like my leg. I'm like, oh my God, I'm like sore from just learning how to stand again. I mean, it was crazy. So what are some other things that we can do to prevent these foot injuries from happening?
That's exactly it. And again, like I said earlier, it always depends per the person, right? Because everybody has different demands and different needs. But for a lot of people, especially I think towards the population that we're talking to, most of these people are already athletes. And so typically it's, they're already strong, they're already fit, at least in context of general populations, And so for a lot of people, it's just making sure our feet in positions that they can absorb and adapt to stress. I know you and I talked a lot about creating a short foot. And for those of you that have no idea what that is, that's basically when you lift the medial arch or the inside portion of your foot in order to make your arch muscles do a better job of absorbing stressors. And for a lot of people, what happens is as we run through our gait cycle, we don't absorb that stress through those foot intrinsic and arch muscles very well. And so we just absorb that stress elsewhere. Oftentimes at the medial knee joint, sometimes the plantar fascia absorbs a lot of that and can get super cranky. And so for people that are already athletes and have already put in the years or time getting strong or getting fit, a lot of times it can be as simple as just helping your body do a better job of absorbing that stress. And once we can do that, we adapt to it. And that's where we get the results that we're wanting to get. They're not only very corrective in nature, they're going to give you a higher ceiling on your performance as well.
I don't want to dig too deep into like what was going on with you, Becca, but I think
your personal problems, Becca.
That would help me a little bit. So can you tell like what was going on with your feet and why you went in to see John? And like, can we use you as a case study?
Sure. So, I mean, I've always kind of had like foot pain, but what started to happen was one, my big toe and the second toe were numb. Like I couldn't even feel, but then I started having like sharp shooting pains. And then as I was running, like I couldn't even like curl my toes at all. And so I was worried like, oh my gosh, there must be some sort of nerve that's really pinched in there. And then started reaching out to one of my good friends that also works there. And I was like, who should I go see a surgeon? And she's like, just go see John and let him take a look at you walking, let him take a look at your foot. And then he talked about that short foot, but also, and that's one of the things we'll talk about, flossing my toes, because my toes I couldn't even like open them. They were all like pinched together. So sometimes I sleep with like what we use for pedicures. I sleep with that in between my toes so that they can expand and loosen up.
John, what was going on with Becca's foot? Like how did that happen?
So a lot of times, and this will speak up to, I think, a lot of people, because this is a pretty common problem. And again, the whys are maybe not as universally agreed on, but a lot of times what happens is, I believe, due to the footwear we grew up wearing, the toes, if you look at children's feet or the feet of people that grew up in maybe third world countries, they didn't grow up wearing shoes, the toes are actually supposed to be the widest portion of the foot. And what happens is if you look at most mainstream shoes or even tennis shoes, but especially any sort of like heel or what would be deemed a cute shoe, the ball of the foot is typically the widest portion of the shoe. The toes kind of come in towards a point. And so when that happens, you apply this low level compression or you push the toes in together. And as we spend steps and steps and months and years in this position, your toes actually lose the ability to function the way they're supposed to function. If you think of your foot intrinsic muscles, just like we have hand intrinsics, which give us our fine motor skills, we also have foot intrinsic muscles. Obviously, the motor skills of the foot intrinsics are not as fine as your hand intrinsic muscles. But they still, what they do is they help us absorb and adapt and do a really good job of creating shock absorption as we walk or as we run. When we lose control of that, the brain then has to do a better or find a different way of absorbing that stress or that shock up the chain, and that can cause, especially if it does that repetitively, that can cause all sorts of issues. And so in Becca's case, her foot intrinsic muscles were not working at all. And so one of the ways that her brain created stability in a compensatory manner was to collapse the inside of her foot, or her foot's built with an arch, but every time she would load that foot, her foot would collapse and her arch would collapse. So we would call that a passive loading of the foot, or how she was creating stability was not actively with her foot intrinsic muscles, but passively through the soft tissues and the inside portion of her foot and ankle. And you just, when you're in those positions, you can't absorb the stress very well. And if you can't absorb it, you're not going to adapt to it. And so then, that's going to cause pain and issues further on down the line. Does that make sense?
Yeah. That's super interesting. Thanks for letting us use your feet today, Becca.
Anytime.
Well, I asked it because my big toe is creeping over to my other toe, so I've got that going on too. I'm curious. So, would you say, like you mentioned this, like growing up and spending a lot of time barefoot as kiddos, is that like a good thing for, in a way of like prevention?
That's a huge thing. I mean, obviously, we don't want kiddos, like we want their feet to be safe, and so in an environment where they need shoes, obviously they should wear shoes, but as much as they can, the more they can be barefoot. The other big thing I tell parents when looking for kids shoes, and I do this with my own shoes as well, or with my own kids as well, the flatter the sole and the wider the toe box, the better off their feet are going to be, because that wide toe box gives room for those foot intrinsic muscles to develop. And the flat sole puts us in a better position for the foot to absorb stress as a whole. Most shoes, and I'm sure you guys are familiar with this, but most shoes tend to have some sort of a heel lift, even running shoes, and that totally changes the mechanics.
Well, that's good to know.
No more cute stilettos.
No.
Yeah. But again, even then, a lot of times people come to me, ladies come to me and they're like, well, does this mean I can't wear heels ever again? And no, that's not what that means. You just have to, just like anything else in life, right? We know that everything comes at a cost. Yeah. And so if you're like, hey, I'm going to wear heels for an evening, and I'm going to know that my feet are probably going to hurt afterwards, and I'm going to have to do some foot self-care afterwards because there's a cost coming to doing business and to wearing those heels. But if you wear heels every day, then yeah, you're probably going to have foot problems.
Yeah. So on that thing about foot self-care, we love that.
Yeah.
How does one kind of manage that day to day and week to week, so that, like myself, I didn't even realize that I had started to compensate and wasn't using my feet the way I should?
I think some of the big things, one of the most easiest things you can do is just get your foot intrinsic muscles to start working. You should be able to push your big toe in the ground and lift your other four toes, and vice versa. Push your little four toes and lift your big toe. You should be able to squeeze your toes in and out. That sounds super simple, and for most people, it's not.
We're doing it right now, John. I don't think
yeah.
so. It's not
For some,
working.
for some people, it causes mental gymnastics.
Well, yeah, that's like when I first came and saw you, I couldn't get that big toe. And then if I could, I was having horrible shooting pain that was going up through my foot. Yeah.
Yeah, and that'll happen oftentimes because the brain's like, well, what the hell? I don't really know what to do with this. But so that's a really easy way to start. You can definitely get like the pedicure spread the toes things, the toe spacers. You can get the cheap pedicure ones. I know if you Google it, there's some podiatrists that make some and sell some. But that just kind of stretches those toes out. And the more range of motion you have in them, the better chance of those foot intrinsic muscles working properly. One of the things I teach patients is I just have them, just like you would interlock your fingers and fold your hands, I have them take their opposite hand and interlock their toes and just spend time kind of messing, extending their toes back, flexing forward, twisting them, because the foot's supposed to be able to do all those things. And because our feet don't do those, we kind of just get stuck with what's essentially just a little club on the end of our leg that doesn't adapt to stress very well. But I would do those things. If you're having problems, I would go talk to a physical therapist or a doctor, making sure that they're well versed in what a foot's supposed to do, and they're not just going to throw you in a insole and say, well, come back to me in 2 years when your pain returns. One of my favorite resources for listeners, you can follow on Instagram, the Foot Collective. They're a group of Canadian, I think PTs and chiros. They do a great job of educating on what the feet are supposed to do, and they do a good job of taking complex ideas and making them very readable. So I really like them. I think a lot of people would appreciate checking those out if they're having foot problems as well.
Cool. We'll put that down as a resource too.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, John, thanks so much for joining us. We like to end every interview asking the interviewee how they live out the Phit philosophy of balancing performance, health, intellect, and taking time for self.
Including foot self-care.
Yeah. Self-care.
Well, like I said earlier, I used to be pretty heavily involved in strength sports. So I competed in strongman Highland Games for several years. I just retired in January from that. And so now I'm just trying to get back down to a reasonable weight. I was about 280. I'm currently about 260 or so, and I'd like to get down to about 240. I've been doing a lot more cross training, maybe even Phit, if you will. And my wife and I both like to hike, so we're actually getting ready to hike the Grand Canyon rim to rim in May.
Oh, good for you.
I've been training for that as well, which is obviously a huge departure from lifting and throwing.
Yeah, some endurance there.
Carrying that backpack.
Yeah. I've been wrecking a lot as well, so.
Oh, well, John, thanks so much for coming on. You give us a lot to think about, and Kara and I have actually trying to foot floss even in here at the same time.
I am. Feet are so interesting.
We'll be sure to put all your information on the show notes, and thanks for coming on.
Awesome. I appreciate it. Thank you guys so much for having me.
Oh, yeah. Thanks, John.
Bye, Queens.
Bye. Thank you to our sponsor today, Sentimano Counseling. Sentimano Counseling is the premier perinatal mental health practice in Kansas City, treating mood disorders during pregnancy and postpartum, perinatal loss, infertility, eating, and exercise disorders. Go to sentimano.com for further information about the practice and services. For additional information on today's topic and guests, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Fit for a Queen.
And hashtag Fit for a Queen.
And don't forget to rate us on iTunes. We can't wait for you to join us next time on Fit for a Queen.
Bye, Queens.